My role tonight is basically to get us started in terms of our conversation and to explain just exactly what we had in mind having this program tonight. When we began soul care at Good Shepherd, there were really two things that we were really concerned to do. One was we were concerned to put an end to talking about pastoral care, is what I call spiritual firefighting. The sort of approach to pastoral care and spiritual nurture that sort of assumes you do church and then when the wheels fall off of life, then suddenly you finally get an opportunity to uh, actually find some personal care from clergy or from someone else. The other inspiration behind doing this was that we wanted to think about spiritual formation in more holistic terms. Uh, Both the Old and the New Testament, as well as the Christian tradition, affirms that creation is a good thing and that the lives that we've been given are God's good gift to us. And for that reason, the whole of our lives is God's concern, not just a portion of our lives. And in the preparation that we receive, we actually are giving ourselves back to that healing work that God does in and through us. Natalie, the rector, my boss, was the one who actually suggested that we start here with this kind of program, which we hope to have on an occasional basis on other topics. And she made the observation that she thought that over the last year, that we were all probably dealing with a good deal of grief from the experience that we've had. And I think that's undoubtedly the case. I've likened COVID-19 to being shoved down an open elevator shaft and being told to figure out just exactly how you respond. And it's all felt a bit like that. So I asked Paul Babb and Carla Babb if they would be willing to really put a program together for us with people who could speak in a holistic fashion to our needs and to helping us think through those needs. Because I suspect that actually COVID-19 and 2021 is going to be the subject of research for decades in almost every discipline. But in the meantime, we need to deal with the results. And for that reason, we want to be rather practical and thoughtful about beginning a conversation that can help us as individuals. Most of you know Paul. In fact, I think all of you probably know Paul, unless you've been going to separate services, in which case you might not, because that's a common phenomenon in most churches. Uh, has done a really thoughtful job of liaisoning with me about all of this in the middle of caring for his own parents in Virginia who are facing a lot of late life trials at the moment. What you probably don't know about Paul, and I've got to refer over here to his resume just so I make sure that I get this right, is that he's a licensed professional counselor. He's been working at it for over 20 years, and that he's had a good deal of experience on the front lines. He's actually worked in the Davidson County jail system and worked there for 10 years as a mental health specialist and as director of the mental health program, where the average population of inmates is around 2,000. And in 2015, he and Carla uh, began sharing a private practice called Cypress Counseling Group. And that's where they devote a lot of their time and effort now dealing with depression, anxiety, substance abuse, and grief issues. And one of the great gifts of this program, and one of the things that we're really hoping to do, is to draw on the strength of our parish and the strength of their professional relationships and friendships to begin building an audience that will receive the kind of help that a program like this can offer. I don't think that there's any better venue than to do that kind of work here. And my prayer is that it'll be helpful to you this evening and that we'll have a good conversation. So I'm going to turn things over to Paul and let him introduce his colleagues. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Father Fred. Thank you, members of Good Shepherd, and everybody who's here tonight, and our speakers who I'll introduce in just a moment. I want to say to everyone who is here, you're already taking a big step forward in kind of thinking about, but also living through what we're going to discuss when it comes to grief. And like I tell anybody who ever steps foot in my office, one, I always commend them for making it that far, because a lot of people never make it into a therapist's office. And if there's anything about kind of the fundamentals of change, it's instead of doing same old, maybe watching the Preds tonight or just having dinner, you decided to do something differently this evening to come and reflect and hopefully learn something from all of us. Then that's the formula for change. That's how it works. So I just want to thank each and every one of you for being here this evening. Father Fred, you did leave out one small portion from my bio. I did reference that I spent my time in the Davidson County Jail on the right side of the bars.
Yes, you did say that.
So I just wanted to clarify that, because when my two children used to go to school when Daddy was working in the jail, and they'd said, "Where's your dad?" "Oh, he's in jail." That would always cause quite the stir with teachers and students alike. So there you have it.
Leave it to our children.
That's right. That's great. Keeps you humble. So without further ado, let me introduce who we have on our panel this evening. This is being recorded, so it's my hope that that this will be shared in other types of venues, so other people can glean a lot of the good information that I know is going to be forthcoming. First off is Dr. Jim Hinson. He is an M.D. and trained in pulmonary critical care and internal medicine at Vanderbilt. He worked in his practice, academic medicine, and consulted in development of various aspects of treatment research. He spent about 20 of those years working in intensive care on a daily basis. So I know he's going to have a lot of great things to share. Stacy Jagger is here with us this evening, mother of 4, author, guest speaker, and mentor. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist and registered play therapist supervisor, as well as an AMFT, which is MFT, with approved supervisor. She's the founder of Music City Family Therapy, which is a unique counseling practice that specializes in integrating play and expressive art therapies for women, children, and families. She is the architect of the 30-Day Blackout, a break from technology designed to bring parents and children closer together and unleash the natural creativity in all of us. So thank you to Stacy for being with us tonight. Dane Anthony, with the gorgeous tree in the back. Dane Anthony is the founder of Soulprint, which is a company focusing on spiritual formation, retreat leadership, and transition. He is a certified spiritual director and is a prepared facilitator with the Center for Courage and Renewal, based on the work of Parker Palmer. Dane also serves as the director of spiritual formation and teaching faculty with Sage Hill Counseling. Additionally, Dane's career in higher education spans more than 30 years in the areas of chaplaincy, student services, and as faculty lecturer. And Dane lives here in Nashville. I'm probably going to get in trouble for this because I didn't introduce her first. But last but certainly never least is Carla Babb. She is also a licensed professional counselor. A lot of her early work in her early days was with youth villages, and she was the director of their statewide crisis program for several years. And she is actually the founder of Cypress Counseling Group, which was founded in 2011. So she asked me to join later on in 2015. But Carla primarily works with adult women, dealing with, she does a lot of work with trauma and grief, a lot of experiential work as well. She, a lot of the time, steps out of the box in how she works with people. She doesn't just work in kind of the traditional 50-minute hour. She will do intensives, whether it's for a day or 2 days, 3 days, really trying to meet people where they are in need. So that's Carla. The next thing I just wanted to let you guys know too is just kind of how the format will play out tonight, because I know this is, we want it to be an open dialogue and a discussion. So it's going to kind of have two pieces or two portions to it. This first part is just the speaker's opportunities just to share for just a few minutes about their particular perspective when it comes to grief. And also not only their perspective, but their expertise and experience. Once we get through that portion of each speaker going through their respective part, we're definitely, that's where we're opening this up wide open to really be a dialogue. You can use the chat box to put your questions in there. Feel free, after all the speakers have presented, you know, you have the little raise the hand icon too that is accessible through Zoom. And so I will be looking for your questions or comments, as well as Ashley's going to be helping out too, just so we make sure that we, you know, just address everything that you would like to know about, because we have a lot of expertise here this evening, to say the least. So with that, I'm just going to lead out kind of with just the basics of what a lot of us may know, some have not heard in a while, just to kind of lay the foundation when it comes to grief. And obviously one of the big names when it comes to grief is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and the things that we hear about the stages of grief, talking about denial, anger, bargaining, sadness, and acceptance. David Kessler actually came along and added another piece to that, of another stage with meaning. And grief I sometimes equate to like the tide. It comes in and it goes out. Sometimes you don't know when or where. Those stages I just listed off don't ever really happen in order. They get juxtaposed and thrown all around. That's why we can sometimes feel like we don't know which way is up. As well as you may feel like, hey, I've gotten some type of closure around an event, and lo and behold, you know, a few hours later, something comes back. And that's how grief oftentimes works. And when I talk about grief tonight, and I think when our other presenters speak too, I like to not only frame grief as the sense of, you know, a lot of times we affiliate it with the death of a loved one in that context, but what we're talking about tonight is the pandemic and the loss of so many different things, whether it's the loss of kind of our personal freedoms, the loss of kind of how we thought life was supposed to be. You know, one of the things I hear so much in my practice is, when are we just going to get back to normal? And it's like, well, one, that scares me, because what's normal? I haven't seen it yet in all of my experience what normal is. So it's kind of looking at this bigger picture of grief. And, you know, hopefully, you know, we'll definitely get to a point where we can talk about maybe some resolve and resilience and and hope on the other side of this, of thinking about, is there kind of an invitation in what we've been living through and continue to live through? So just wanted to kind of lay that out for us. And Carla was just going to speak just a little bit about just kind of her experience and perspective.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, you know, I find that in my work with clients over this past year, it's usually not that they're in grief around the loss of a person, a death of a person. That certainly has shown up over the past year, but so often what I'm noticing is clients are coming in with a deep amount of sadness or overwhelm, and they're not claiming it as grief. They're not naming that as a grief response, but it feels too big. It doesn't fit their typical sad experience, maybe prior to the pandemic. And what I've recognized with them, I think, is that when it's a loved one that they've lost, then our body's response and our emotional response matches. I think I'm noticing most is that when clients come in and their experience feels out of containment, they're not in that normal window of tolerance where they're feeling sadness or they're feeling a sense of loss. If they're not claiming it as grief, it seems like their responsiveness to it doesn't match. So they keep going to work, they keep showing up in all the roles they're supposed to be playing with their families, and they're not attending to the needs that are peaking in the process of this grief that is showing up in their life. I had a client who was experiencing quite a bit of grief from just the conflict that she was exposed to with her family and her extended family and her family, really walking through the pandemic very differently. And there was a lot of hurt and there was a lot of disconnection in that relationship. And once we started to name that as grief, it seemed like it allowed her to hold it in a more accurate way. She was much kinder to herself. Think about this: when you have someone that passes away, the responsiveness of the community always matches that, right? We bring food to people who have lost someone. It doesn't feel unusual to sleep longer or to have to not get out of bed sometimes, or to feel like we're sluggish and kind of walking through mud. And when we're doing that and we don't call it grief, we can have the tendency to they'll minimize our experience, maybe even shame our experience. What's wrong with me? Why am I not handling this better? I think the invitation I would just offer is that as you could claim grief, it gives you space to be in your process differently and get your needs met differently. And so when I think about some of the ways that I'm encouraging my clients as they walk through this process of grieving school, my kiddos are doing online school all year. So there's a grief process that my junior is going through, not having a junior year with anybody. The isolation, there's grief around the isolation she's experiencing. They haven't done many sports, so there's a grieving around just the connection and excitement of being a part of a team. We haven't been able to see loved ones in over a year that are long distance and fly to different places where we can connect. So we've, with a parent who is in his mid 70s, we've lost a whole year with him. So there's a grief around recognizing that we don't get that back. There's no way to get that time back. And so I would just name that some of the things that I think are so important to have in place so that grief can happen is, one is going to be validation. So to just validate that this is actually grief, to be able to acknowledge that it is real pain, that we're not overreacting, that the response that we're having to something that is monumentally different than we've ever lived through, that our response matches that. Because I think we end up being more tender with ourselves. We show up with our partners and our people differently around what we might need out of that. We also need emotional and physical safety to be able to walk through grief. So if I'm feeling grief and I go to my spouse, who he wouldn't do this, but if he did, and said, come on, we've got to get over this, you got to adjust to, this is the way life is, and there's an attempt to minimize or dismiss, I'm going to shut down, I'm going to pull back, I'm not going to have a way to really explore what's showing up for me. So emotional and physical safety are really important. Time, I think so often we don't adjust our way of being in our patterns in our life to match what is showing up. So I know for Paul and I at the beginning of the pandemic, we dropped our client load by about 80%, which seems off. That seems opposite of what you might think. But we recognize that with the amount of grief we were holding day to day, hour to hour with clients, we were going to need to take care of ourselves differently than we would historically in the way that we do this work, because we're also walking through the same parts of this world that we're grieving too. This isn't something that we can kind of stand back and be with someone who's having a completely different experience. So giving ourselves time to slow down, I think, is another way that we're allowing grief to have room to be present. And then there's going to be, somebody that is there for you. So having a very specific person that's able to relate, that's able to say, gosh, me too, that makes so much sense, to feel seen and known in the experience that you're walking in. And then another thing that we need to have is sobriety. And I don't mean not drinking a beer. Sometimes I mean that, but sobriety means being very present with your experience and not choosing to numb it with overwork, too much exercise, shopping a lot, staying too busy. All of those things move us away from being with our experience so that we can really understand what's showing up and take care of it in a healthy way. So I just wanted to name some of the ways that we've tried to step into that grief work with our clients this past year. Paul, I don't know if you had any other needs around what you wanted me to cover there.
Sure. No, and I would say now our caseloads are way up over 110%.
Yeah.
So just the, just the demand that we've seen is just, it's great. I've told, there's people that I supervise who I've just said, I've seen a lot, by working in the jail, working mobile crisis for these last 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this in kind of the toll that what we have experienced and are experiencing. So I think if you look at some of the news outlets, there's a lot of talk about grief and how this will be with us for years to come. And so I think, Carla, thank you for sharing what you did. Jim, would you like to?
Okay, I'm going to violate a rule that we were given, but I violated it anyway. And that is, I'm going to just work off slides for just a second. It was very interesting to listen to Carla just then, because a lot of the themes that I'm going to bring up are going to echo some of the ones that she did. Of course, I've been retired for a while and retired from clinical practice. Sorry, I have a cat who Zoom bombed us. The concept of what happens in an intensive care unit with not the patient, but with the family of the patient looked a lot to me like what was happening with families who were having to deal with patients, their family members who had COVID, who went into hospitals or had to go into quarantine or isolation. The medical intensive care units all intensive care units are very stressful places, and they cause a lot of stuff to happen to people. The first has already been mentioned, they're in isolation. The family member can't get to them. In the old days, getting into an ICU was almost impossible except for a few minutes a day. Now they're better about getting that done. ICU areas are very scary, they're hectic. Patients look sick. If you've ever been in an intensive care unit, you know this. If you watch one on TV, it's not at all like that. It's very chaotic. It's 24 hours of busyness. Family members who are family members who are with someone who's in an ICU feel very helpless. They often can't communicate with the patient. They can't communicate frequently with the medical staff. They feel guilty. They're pressured. They're incredibly anxious. They don't know how long this is going to last. What if my loved one dies? This is all what was happening as I was watching the pandemic occur. This is what was happening with families who had people go into ICUs, even just into hospitals. A quick aside, my college roommate, best friend in college and medical school and training, is still practicing internal medicine, and he's on a COVID unit right now. And he echoes this stuff to me when I talk to him. That's what they see in terms of what the families do. So families respond to the COVID patients, from my talking with present day practitioners, like they do when their family members are in the intensive care unit. They become very vigilant. They want to know everything all the time. So what they do, they hang out in the waiting room. Now the hospitals now don't let them hang out in the waiting room for COVID. They make them go home. And that's probably a good thing for multiple reasons, but still they maintain this vigilance. They have this pressure to add something to the care. They gotta do something. They feel this great need to add something to the life of their loved one. In doing so, they ignore their own needs. And Carla mentioned this as well in her talk in a very different way, but they completely forget their physical needs. They don't eat properly. They don't rest. They don't exercise. They don't practice spirituality. They don't do the diversions that the day normally holds for them. They don't take their medicines properly. They fail to go to medical appointments that they may have, particularly if they're from out of town and have a long distance to go. And they don't go to church. They don't do their regular worship practice because they feel that need to be with the patient. And again, my discussions with other medical practitioners now is that this is what's happening now as well. That, of course, leads to the complete ignoring of their own mental needs. And the resulting increase of that is, the result of that is increasing physical illnesses. I have had in my practice, side by side, patients of the same family. One came into the ICU with certain things, and another one, the wife or husband, came in with another illness because they ignored their own physical health. I've had that happen at least twice. So that's what families do. So how do we get around this? What do I tell families? I've told my own family this. I've told myself this when my father was in an ICU. The old thing about, you get on an airline, they start going through the safety stuff and they tell you to put your own oxygen mask on first. You cannot help anybody else if you're sick. So I tell people, don't hang around the waiting room, go home, find a hotel room if you're from out of town. I don't want to come out here and see you just sitting around waiting for me unless it's the standard rounding time, or I'm coming out to give advice, or I've let you know you need to be here. Get out of here. We'll get you. There's cell phones. We'll have you back here if something needs to happen, or if you can visit. They need to eat regular food, good, normal food, not fast food, not the hospital cafeteria for, you use regular meals and make them healthy meals. Don't just snack out of the machines. This is a surprise to a lot of people. Avoid caffeine and other stimulants. These folks whose families are in an intensive care unit or in a COVID environment, again, we talked about them being hyper vigilant. They are already up. They don't need the caffeine stimulation. Stop doing that. Don't try to stay awake by doing it. Get quiet contemplation. If you're religious, and I think everybody on this call likely is, prayer. Almost all hospitals, everyone I ever worked in, there's some around 11 of them, have chapels. And usually they have chaplains, and the chaplains will come by and they spend a lot of time with critically ill patients. Again, with the COVID, you're not in the hospital environment, but the churches have chapels, and the churches have clergy, and the churches have people who work with clergy, like the soul care team at Good Shepherd. And lean on your family and friends. Don't try to do everything yourself. People offer you help, take it. Take it from your family, take it from your friends and your close church members. When you are lucky to have those people around, use them, because you would be glad to do it for them. So they'll be glad to do it for you, and it's a gift, and accept the gift. That's all I needed to say about it at this time, and we'll wait for the questions. And I'll take this off the screen if I know how to do it. There it is.
But thank you, sir.
Thanks
So much.
And now we're going to hear a little bit from Stacy.
Hey, everybody. So I'm Stacy Jagger, and I am a family therapist that works primarily with children and families. My youngest client is 3. I do work with the adolescent population as well, but I really love working with the little ones. So 3 to 12 is pretty typical, and working with their parents and siblings as well. And in the beginning of the pandemic, what I found to be really interesting with young children is that if you'll kind of rewind a minute and think about how busy everybody was. Now, when you're a young child and you're, being told what to do from the minute your eyes wake up, brush your teeth, get your clothes on, eat breakfast, get on the bus, then you get to the bus and then get off the bus and then you go to class and then you're told what to do all day. And then, so for young children that were being told what to do all day long and multiple activities after school with soccer and baseball, and what was so interesting to me is those anxious clients, young children, when the pandemic hit and they were forced to be at home, many of their anxious symptoms went away. And what I found to be really interesting is that many of the parents, that I was working with would say, one of these days we're going to slow down and really focus on the simple things, and what ended up happening for many of those young children that I was working with a year ago, they graduated pretty quickly after the pandemic hit because their true underlying attachment needs were being met. So that being said, then, I think Carla was talking about her caseload went down for a while and then then it skyrocketed. I experienced the same thing. And what I'm seeing now is really a systemic grief in the whole family system. And when a child is grieving, what's really interesting is parents can be grieving and expect their child to grieve similarly. But in looking at a young child through the lens of the nervous system, so without getting overly scientific, we have our sympathetic nervous system that revs us up, and then we have our parasympathetic that sort of calms us down. And many children, I look at them through the lens of the nervous system because I'm trying to figure out if I can get them into their window of tolerance where they feel grounded and calm and poised, and where they can ask for their needs to be met, and they're emotionally literate, and they just feel like they're okay in the world. But in working with parents that are extremely overwhelmed, what generally happens is because families are systems, that anxiety and depression just kind of trickles down to the children. And so what I'm seeing now are children that are really kind of taking on the stress that they're seeing in their parents. And I just want to bring this up because in working with children with all kinds of behavioral problems, I do see that there is an underlying grief, although just like Carla was saying, they may not name it as that. But the research shows now that children are now on screens about 7 hours a day, and that is not including their school time. So if a child is grieving and they are constantly on video games, iPad, computer, TV, all the things, they really don't have the margin to feel what they're feeling. And I think parents many times are unintentionally giving them so much screen time that they don't have the space to really feel what they're feeling. And so part of the way that I work with children is I inspire families to turn their screens off, except for what is absolutely necessary for school and work, for about a month, where their free time is more involved in engagement and nurture and challenging each other and real true connection, rather than everybody being in their own rooms, scrolling their phones and all the things. And so what I find is when a family integrates some sort of a screen time detox, or whatever you want to call it, I call it a blackout, about day 5, it gives the whole family an opportunity to really reconnect, because they are choosing to turn off all the screens and all the distractions in order to really connect well. And what I find over and over again are that parents really think that their children are occupied with their screen time, but if they'll turn it off and really get present with their children, they're finding that their children really are grieving and need, you know, a bigger, wiser, stronger, and kind container for the child to really be able to express all of that. And so I kind of choreograph that in my office. And the thing about children, young children, is that, you know, they're extremely resilient, and the neural pathways in their brain will kind of reform to, you know, deal with the masks. And although, you know, I have my whole opinion about that and speech development, and I'm not going down that train, but anyways, but they really are quite resilient. And what I find, and I'll share this little flip chart with you. If you don't know about the TheraPlay Institute, I'm a huge believer in the TheraPlay model of play therapy, because for many busy families, if you will integrate with a young child or a grandchild 5 or 10 minutes of TheraPlay once or twice a day, it really extends the amount of time that they feel like they've spent with you. And I integrate TheraPlay with my own children. You know, I have a very busy practice and I have 4 kids. And so the time that I spend with them doing TheraPlay is very meaningful. And if you're a working parent, or, you know, if you're in the hospital or whatever, I even do, you know, some TheraPlay sessions on, you know, remote telehealth appointments where I'm choreographing TheraPlay sessions with parents and children to be able to learn this model. And it's a co-regulation experience, and so it really calms children on the inside and helps them just to feel like they're loved and cared for, and that they feel seen and heard and celebrated and delighted in. And that's really just meeting the need of a young kiddo. So was that 5 minutes? Was that
It was
3
perfect.
minutes?
That was
Okay.
perfect.
Okay.
And really good information for sure. Dane, what do you have for us?
Well, it's great to be here. And in some respects, going last is helpful because a lot of what I was thinking of saying and planning to say has been said in some regards. But I think in particular, in my spiritual direction practice, what I'm encountering, mostly sit with men, is the elimination. I think maybe Carla said something about this in just a little bit ago, the elimination of the distractions that we have in place, even ways in which we distract ourselves spiritually by the doing of things. And particularly early in COVID, when everything was really shutting down and we were losing the ability to be connected to those things that we were familiar with or historically were helpful for us, particularly things around connection and presence of others, was feeling really threatened. And over time, the words that I'm hearing a lot are, I'm tired, I feel numb, I feel flat. And in particular around spiritual practices, because so many of those historically have been associated with an active life in a parish, or a Bible study, or a service project of some kind. And find myself talking with my directees a lot about our need during this time to take back the onus of responsibility for our spiritual growth and formation, and own that in a way that is often really new territory for people, that there's been a reliance on the institutional church or the local parish to be kind of the impetus or the location of where those things happen. And so it's been a really beautiful process of inviting people into a number of different ways to practice their daily spiritual life in a more rhythmic way. And it's been, I keep using the language new territory because it is offering people a way to experience themselves with themselves and themselves with God in some really new landscape. internally and externally. And a lot of my work really revolves around what I call transition or threshold experiences, is the movement from one place to another. And have been finding this last year, lots and lots of nuanced dynamics around being on that threshold experience of one foot in kind of a familiar old way, and in this really new space of experiencing God in slowing down. Several people have talked about that. The removal of order and living in kind of a disordered experience, and not knowing how to carry that as long as we're now being asked to carry that. And I think in the ways that I think about transition, I have a couple of phases of transition that I've been thinking about and writing about for a while. And the first stage I call necessary grief. And it is the attention to the work as I'm moving from one place to another, that if I don't do both the sadness and the traditional grief experience about the way that things are changing, then I'll carry that into my next experience. But I also think it involves an acknowledgement of the things that I use the phrase celebration, that we're celebrating what the transition has offered to us in the gifting of relationships or ways in which we've seen ourselves grow and had new awareness and insight. And I've connected it with the image of a trapeze. Paul, you and I have talked about this before, of being on the podium with the bar in your hand and recognizing that things are about to shift. They're about to move. I'm being asked to jump into new space or transition into new space. And all of the things that are coming up that I've been experiencing during COVID myself, and certainly with the people I meet with, of not really wanting to let go of what you call the normal pieces, because there's so much uncertainty in it. And yet, the transition within the pandemic has caused us to let go of a number of things. Ideas, and you were talking about this earlier, Paul, ideas we had about what 2020 might look like, or 2021 now. Ideas about engagement and relationship, ideas about projects that I might enter into, and the sadness and the grief of not knowing how to be in that for this extended period of time, and the weightiness of it. And my second phase I call suspended animation. And I think that's where we've been living. I was listening to Father Fred talking about the elevator shaft. And I think there's a sense for me too of being suspended in this place. And we don't know how long it's going to be. And the propensity we have to maybe jump to the very, very first bar that's coming our direction and take it, even if it's not the one that we sense we need to take. But the fear of being in this place that we don't know how to be with has been really, really weighty. And I think is certainly creating some, at least small t trauma, if not large t trauma for lots of people. And the spiritual part of that is because the practices are not familiar, or they're gone in the way that people have experienced it, then they're feeling very, very distant. I'm hearing lots of people talk about God feeling really distant, inaccessible. I had a guy just last week say, like, God is so far away. And I said, how far away does God feel? And he said, Kansas, like really, really far away. And so living into a sense of resting in what we do know about the love and peace of God and presence of God in the midst of a time where we're desiring connection and often find that difficult to do. I think our spiritual practices can really create foundations for us. And the practices that I'm finding people resonating most with are the ones that are very, very simple. Breathing prayers, meditation, whether it's with an app or, and I have one guy who said, I need a reminder. I just can't, I've got so much going on. I don't know how to do this. And so I encouraged him to set an alarm on his phone 2 or 3 times a day, just as a reminder to pause for a moment. He could, and it's changing him because it's moving into what several of us have talked about today, moving us into a slowing that has, for me, as I sit with folks, a deeper sense of trust. That there is a holding, maybe to stay in the trapeze metaphor, there is a net, and then the net may not be as far away as it seems. I sense that's probably enough for me. Paul, thank you.
Thank you, Dane. And with that, I'm curious, there are some questions or comments that anyone has. I think one thing that you brought up, Dane, is this kind of need for simplicity. And as you were kind of sharing about, whether it's something on the breathing exercise front, I know that with a lot of my clients, there are several apps that you can download. Insight Timer is a free app, and so I know a number of people will utilize that. Calm is another app. Headspace is another app that can be good for just slowing down. And one of the words I've heard tonight is being more intentional, for sure.
I think one of the things that I hear from folks a lot as I'm talking with them about really simplifying is it doesn't feel enough. They feel like they need to do more than that, that's not okay. Either that God will be disappointed or they're just so used to filling space with things that having space that's unfilled doesn't feel okay. I have a former student who told me that I told her probably 25 years ago, not all space is meant to be filled. And so how do we be present to this sense of space that's available to us in ways that's uniquely different than we've ever had before? And rest in a sense of enoughness.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, I have a question, and I'd be happy to hear any of you respond to this. I think that one of the real problems over the last year has had less to do with the virus and more to do with the way that we've navigated the virus as a society. I think that we took a fundamentally materialist approach to dealing with this virus, by which what I mean is that we named the problem being communicating a disease, and the main challenge being the threat to us physically. And so what we did was we shut people up in their homes, and we closed down hospitals to anyone but medical personnel. And we deprived people of contact with clergy and chaplains who did much of their work remotely if they were able to do it at all. And we ignored or sublimated spiritual and emotional needs to the physical. And that wasn't without reason, to be sure. And initially, it wasn't meant to be as long a period of time as it's actually proven to be. But now what we have is we have people who are really suffering at every age to a profound isolation that has had unintended consequences that in many cases have been as serious, and in some cases even potentially more serious than the virus itself. And I wonder what the panelists think about that issue and what they think about, granted the fact that the decisions have been made, and granted the fact that none of us were really empowered to change the way society navigated the virus. What any or all of you think about alternative ways of addressing that isolation?
That's a good question. And, I think in some ways what you outlined, Father Fred, it's almost like COVID has been actually the symptom of something much deeper in our culture and in our society. And the one thing that I'm hearing tonight, especially I think with all the panelists, is this need for connection, like not to be isolated. Most of, any therapist you'll talk to, there's usually some acknowledgement about from day one, we are born to connect. If we don't connect with another human being, we're not going to thrive. We're not going to grow. And obviously there's plenty of studies about when we're isolated. And I think even what Stacy shared earlier about, gosh, some of the kids she was working with, they actually got better when they got home because they were around their families and around that family unit. And obviously, we're in new territory sort of when we talk about kind of just generationally how you're free to move about the country now or about the world. We're no longer in our tight-knit communities, and finding community and connection is such a challenge. And so COVID's just kind of blown that all to bits. And yes, with all the lockdowns and restrictions, it's enacted a heavy toll, because a lot of the stats that are coming out is like the people that are seeking mental health services right now have quadrupled in the last year, just because of this other part, just not the physical danger or risk with COVID, but the psychological, the emotional, the spiritual side of it.
What I hear, Father Fred, and what you're describing is that there's a trauma in the way that we've experienced the pandemic, the scientific part of it, and there's a secondary trauma in the way that we responded to shutting down, closing down, coming up under our own roofs, and really getting out of every pattern that is familiar to us and having to create new patterns. And what I think I'm aware of in the work, I do a lot of trauma work with clients, and some of the research will tell you that you can have, let's say, two people that are in the army go off to war, and just because you go through a trauma, it does not mean that both will be traumatized by it. And the difference, I think, is how you move through experiencing the trauma, which is from a resilient mindset, a resilient position. And so people who are resilient people do very important things to help create the experience that all of us are going through, to make sure that they're shifting it in a way that does not create traumatization. One of the biggest things I think that they do is they're really careful to mind the stories they tell themselves about what's happening. So I can say, the government is doing this to me. I can say, I'm powerless. I can say, we're all going to die. There is a way to sit and tell myself a story to create meaning about what I'm experiencing that will accelerate and impact the way that my body and my emotions process the traumatization of that. Versus if I'm really careful about the story I'm telling myself, I'm mindful about recognizing that even with this shutdown, like what Stacy was saying, maybe there's a gift here about stepping into I lose access to my extended friends and maybe extended family, but what would it be like for me to really recognize the connections I can make with my husband and my children, and what a gift that is, even if it's short term, that I can show up and that there's gratitude around that. If I'm really intentional about and mindful about the stories I tell myself, there's an opportunity, I think, to be protective about the trauma that I'm going through. I think the other thing that resilient people practice is is meaning making, making sure that we're finding meaning in what we're walking through, looking for the places to have gratitude around it. And resilient people have a practice of gratitude, not just every once in a while name something that they're grateful for, but they're building a muscle of gratitude. So there's a practice of daily, regular naming and noticing, so that their scanning of their environment starts to change. And I start to pick up on 2 or 3 things daily that I want to make sure that I'm marking and noticing, that I want to make sure I'm recognizing is healthy and helpful for me. I think resilient people also grieve and tell the truth about their loss. So they're not minimizing their experience, they're naming it and then pursuing interaction with other people so that it's shared through Zoom or a phone call or with the people that are under their roof, so that it's not done in private. Those soldiers that go off to war and come back, so often it's something that they learn to just swallow down and dismiss their experience from their own awareness, even much less bringing it out into the open with someone else. So if we're really cultivating resilience, we're accessing that experience in those moments of silence, in those moments of all the things that I do to keep myself busy and it's been stripped away. Do I actually turn inward, pay attention to lonely, sadness, anger, hurt, and then show up with somebody and say, I'm feeling this, and feel seen and known in that? That is another layer of resilience and preparation around how we're absorbing this, what could feel like a traumatic year for a lot of people. They're also grounded in really good self-care. And so they're doing the practice of, I can't go to my massage therapist, but what if the kids and I can practice giving each other foot massages, and we're making sure that we're, going for walks because it's beautiful outside. And my gosh, our family has done more walks this past year than we have ever done in our entire family life together. So there's some things that I think we're intentional around, just noticing we've got to create new patterns that really install things that we think are going to lift us through this rather than bring us down.
Thanks, Carla. I'll just kind of riff off of that real quickly. A lot of times, I tell my clients, if I spoke to my friends or family or anybody else, sometimes the way that I speak to myself, that I wouldn't have any friends or family, because I am, it's just that negative piece of always, what could I do better? I messed up here. And so kind of what Carla is kind of lining out for us is kind of almost this reverse golden rule, in a way that I saw somebody had written when it comes to this thing of self-care, which is do unto yourself as you would do unto others. And so it actually harkens to Jim's thing of, when you get on the plane, you've got to put on your mask first. I actually use that same metaphor when I'm working with couples of, they have just, talk about some really big time damages in marriages this past year, big time, is this need of, hey, you've got to put your masks on first. If you guys aren't taking care of you, the kids aren't getting taken care of, each other's not getting taken care of. So just wanted to kind of add into that piece.
Thanks. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, Jim, I need to say I really appreciated your conversation about people being in an ICU, because I've seen that a lot in the parish. And of course, I'm getting to see it up close and personal here right now, because my dad's dying at home, and watching the family come in and out. One of the things that's been real interesting, my dad's not dying of COVID. My dad's dying because of, I think in part, because after the lockdown, all of his health problems caught up with him. He was deprived of his every morning gym. He was deprived of his weekly breakfast club with his buddies. He was deprived of his walk. And of course, then, in New Hampshire last March, the weather wasn't fit for anyone to get out. When it finally got out, they were still not allowed out. And then this fall, they haven't, even now, the neighbors can't come in. They live in a community where the neighbors would be really good about providing for them and visiting and caring for them, and then nobody can see them. So I'm watching that kind of deprivation bring to the fore all of the health problems that were already there and being held back because of the other kinds of engagement and stuff that he was able to do to manage his own health. And then I get to do both because, you know, I'm trained to watch family systems in a grieving situation, and I'm part of the family system. So it gets to be real special. But the stuff you talked about, Jim, about hypervigilance and about not taking care of oneself, you know, I'm certainly seeing that, and would love to find ways. And I don't want this to be about me. I've got a 12-year-old and 15-year-old niece here, and I'd love to talk to Stacy about how we help them deal with their own grief around losing a grandfather when their parents are taciturn, to say the least. But that's a different conversation and one we can have somewhere else. But I really have seen that whole ICU family dynamic, Jim, up close and personal. And I really appreciate your bringing it to the fore, because I've seen it in the parish and I'm seeing it now in a very real way.
Jim, you're muted. Yeah.
Yep, I was hitting the wrong space bar. I have two keyboards up. Sorry. The analogy is striking to me, and what I'm hoping is that we come out of this analogy a little, somewhat like we did in the ICU. That when I first started doing it, ICUs were open bay, curtains around beds, close together. Everybody was exposed to all the noise and everything that went on. So you had to keep families out just because of that. When we first built our first, isolation units where everybody had walls between them, we learned that it was better to have families involved and have the families in if you could. You couldn't always, and you had to run them out from time to time. And some families were pretty disruptive. But if the family could be in there, it was better for everybody, including the nursing staff, who began to endorse this. So it struck me moments ago when I think Fred was talking about the idea that, we just went to this complete shutdown all of a sudden. Two things crossed my mind. One is, since the pandemic of 1918, we haven't seen anything like this medically, and we've never seen it with the ability to handle it. So you saw a medical system respond to the thing it knows how to do, and isolate, keep the virus away, do all this, do that, throw everything at it you could throw at it, and then we'll start picking it apart and find out what we can loosen up. So what I'm hoping is that right now we're in the let's start allowing people to get together phase. If you notice, the CDC this week has said if you're vaccinated, and the data supports this, the data that I've seen supports it. If you've 2 weeks past your second vaccination, or you're 4 weeks past your single vaccination for the J&J vaccine, then you can get together without a mask and without social distancing with people who are like that. In other words, they too vaccinated. That's going to help a lot. I think families, that's going to be a whole lot better, but you still can't go out in crowds. You don't know the people because you don't know who's not vaccinated and who's not. So we're opening it up. It's coming better, just like happened over decades with the ICU. We'll bring this out to where we're back to sort of normal, whatever that ends up being, or at least more traditional ability to visit with the sick folks and run only our usual psychic traumas with that, as opposed to the ones put into with this situation. I told my colleague, and I've told, I can't imagine what it's like, because I didn't do it. I can't imagine what it's like to practice in that environment.
Mm-hmm.
We got a lot of our own psychic release by being able to talk to families. It was psychic pressure on us, but it was also a nice release to be able to go and say, and here's what, here's what was going on, and transmit that information so they knew. We spent as much time taking care of families as we did patients.
Oh.
And so that's that. I can't imagine trying to do this and not being able to talk to families. I can't imagine being a family with a loved one in a hospital or quarantine and I couldn't see them. I've told my wife if she gets COVID and has to go in the hospital, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'll break in. So I'm just hoping that things do get better.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jim. I did have a question come across the wire. Actually, Stacy, this is for you. What would you recommend, for parents to help their children grieve, or maybe even some of the signs or things to look for? Because obviously the language sometimes is different in how kids experience grief than how adults might see it or experience it.
Can you read me the beginning of that question?
What do you recommend for parents in helping their?
I got it.
Yeah.
So I feel like a broken record, and so forgive me. But the easiest way that you can show up for your children is just turn the screens off, and that means your phone, having time blocking around your phone of this is when I'm available and this is when I'm not. So split attention with children can be very confusing because most children, the story they tell themselves is you're really not present with me. And so by turning the screens off and putting your phones away, just that gives children the message that I'm here to have conversations with you, that your presence matters to me, that I'm not distracted. And just little comments that you can make with your children of noticing their affect, of I'm noticing that you're feeling frustrated right now. Will you tell me more about that? Or I'm noticing that you're feeling sad to me. Can you talk to me about that? Or can we play a game of Uno together? Just the whole field of interpersonal neurobiology is so interesting in working with children, because just by having a calm, non-anxious presence with a child, if all you're doing is just playing an Uno game or a game of Connect Four or whatever it is that you enjoy, there is a relaxation that happens, and where your nervous system is kind of dancing with theirs, and it's a co-regulation experience for the child, and all of a sudden they start to feel like they're okay on the inside, and they can't really name why, but it's because you have made the choice to be present. And so I don't know if I'm answering your question very well, but I feel like so much of the children that I'm seeing in my practice that parents are many times making it harder than it really is, because sometimes you just need to put down your phone. I mean, I think there's a quote that 2% of loving your child well is effort, and 98% is putting down your phone. And so I am literally saying the same thing in my office over and over and over again about this. So, and being connected to yourself. I think we talk a lot about being connected to God. I think it's important too to be connected to yourself. And when you're connected to yourself and God, children really pick up on that. And kids don't listen; they watch. And unfortunately for all of us that they don't listen, they watch, they watch you and they follow suit.
Right.
And as far as the question you had about the 12 and the 14-year-old, it's the same thing, like social media is really wrecking adolescents' sense of self. And I talk a lot about waiting until at least 8th grade to give a child social media, if at all possible. There is an internet-free phone called the Gabb wireless phone. It looks just like a smartphone, but I call it a smarter phone for kids because it looks like a smartphone, but it's actually not, because you can't get on the internet with it. You can't do social media on it, but they don't feel left out, and they can still call you and text you and that kind of thing. But it, I mean, it really boils down to presence, you know, being present, and that all of the distractions of technology have really kind of hijacked children's childhoods. You know, the many kids would rather be plugged in to Fortnite than they would be, than they want to go, you know, hiking with their parents or going for a bike ride or whatever. And so just setting boundaries around screen time, just that alone. I mean, if you turn everything off, kids, just like Paul was saying, they're hardwired to connect. So if you turn everything off, they're going to come out of their bedrooms and connect with you. I mean, they're going to want to play
Right.
Uno.
Yeah.
They're going to want to play Monopoly. So it's that
Mhm.
simple. So anyways, I hope that was helpful.
Oh, super helpful. And that's something we've noticed in our household when we have been able to do that, because it is hard. Like sometimes after you've had a long day, you want to come home and kind of zone out on the phone or play Candy Crush or something like that. I'm telling on myself. But our kids, like, I mean, we've played so many board games in the midst of this pandemic, and it's just been great to kind of reconnect in that way with them. So thank you
I
for
tell
sharing that.
families, just let's just bring this back to 1979, you know, and just take it back in the day, you know, make the most of it.
That's
So,
right.
I would just add too, I don't work with kids anymore. I used to a lot in my family systems work, but I do a lot of work now with adults where we go back in and we unpack their storyboards and their stories and what it was like for them as a child. And I'm always listening for how much attunement did they get from an adult to help them figure out what they were feeling, because our children don't have language for that right away. They don't understand. They feel bad. They don't know what bad is. I remember one time, probably 3 or 4 years ago, Jack was up in his room crying at the end of the day. We were getting him in bed, and I was doing acrobats, trying to figure out what on earth was he upset about. And he just kept saying, I don't know. I don't know. I just feel so bad. I don't know. And so I spent just some time with him trying to pursue what was, you know, one of the key things I'm listening for if a child got their needs met in their adult life, if I'm going back trying to get a sense of where their needs met, was someone reaching into their experience and helping them understand what was happening. It's pretty key. And so I think, as I think about what you're describing, Stacy, and having the technology off and sitting and playing games and having them have access to you, and then as whatever shows up, irritability a lot of times for kids is sadness. Sometimes sadness is about them acknowledging something that they love is gone. So sometimes you can get at it by really unpacking what is it that they love, because that's how we experience sadness, is to recognize what's missed, what's gone, what's lost that I value so much. And so they don't know how to say that or name that. But the more that we can help name, I think then they know what to do with that. Then they know, oh, this is what's going on for me. It doesn't feel like such a mystery anymore. And then there's attunement and connection with the parent because we sit with them around that.
Mm-hmm.
kids in general, they will set you up to feel what it feels like to be them. And so if you, in sitting with them, can kind of feel what you're feeling in their presence, and you can name what's happening in your own body, many times it kind of normalizes what they're feeling. And then there's this opportunity for empathy. So I tell parents a lot, when you're sitting with your child, just remember they're setting you up to feel what it feels like to be them. So if they're irritable, you can just simply say, you know, I'm feeling a little irritable right now. Is that matching what's happening with you? And it can kind of open up a whole conversation with them that's, you know, vulnerable and open and safe. So
That's really good. And I would even say, you know, obviously even into adulthood, a lot of times when we're walking and working with our clients, and especially with couples, we talk about kind of the fundamentals of connection. Like, how do we, you know, feel calmed or soothed? It's when we're seen, it's when we're heard, and when we're validated. And those needs never go away, you know, whether we're 1 or 99 or 109. It's just so important. And that's a delicate art to practice, because a lot of times, you know, couples will come in and ask me, like, fix us, do this. What do we need to do? And it's this thing of trying to shift to the here and now of actually doing relationship is a real-time effort. We can't rest on our laurels or pretend like we know everything. It's a very active process, and I think that's one of the words I've heard tonight is intentional. We need to be more intentional, whether it's with our kids or with even ourselves, our relationship with ourselves, relationship with God. There's a huge opportunity in the midst of kind of this vacuum of the pandemic.
Dane, I have a question for you, because you touched on something that certainly a lot of the literature right now is pointing pastors toward, in that people feel like God is so distant, and therefore church is distant, even when they can attend safely. Church is unnecessary now because God isn't involved in my life. All those things. What are you telling people about that? Because I've noticed since the beginning of the pandemic that without Sunday service, it requires a lot more regular touch, to use that kind of language, for congregants to feel any kind of connection. But I'm also noticing lots of them who say, I just don't need to come back anymore.
Yeah.
Because this has all disappeared from my life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question. I think I'm finding a lot of people who are admitting that they have been struggling with church relationship for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
It's how they've always done it, and they're wanting something fresh and new, an enlivening or a generative experience with the divine. And I think as several of you were talking about, getting out and taking walks and being with those that we care about have become not just placeholders for the sense of connection and presence, but ways in which we are being Christ to and with each other in it. And I am curious to see what church looks like post-COVID. So I think, and there's a fairly new Barna study that just came out not 2 or 3 weeks ago that's talking about at least 20 to 30% of people will not return to a church or parish that they were probably pretty active in before. So I'm finding it, and a lot of my directees are people who've been struggling with the relationship with church to begin with, or have been wounded or hurt by institutional church, and are trying to find a way to live out the spiritual nature of who they are, but it's always been connected to the institution. And finding ways to come back to it differently. And I think what I was saying earlier about taking the onus of responsibility for my own spiritual growth has become a really new place for people that is then reframing the relationship that they have with church. And so I think it's going to ask the church to be really agile and intentional about some things, maybe a simplification of things. But I think there's an honoring that people are experiencing about their connection to the natural world in the ways that they've been talking about. Like on a day like today, goodness, here is just absolutely gorgeous, and yet trying to lean people back toward community, and that's what parishes do best, is creating a cohesive and resilient community. And so I don't have an answer to that, but I'm in that conversation with people a lot about, like, I don't know how to do this. And I want to get back. I'm with Paul. I don't use the word normal anymore. But back to something that's familiar, I think, because we find comfort in that, and comfort with people who we know deeply. And yet also encouraging people to explore. When Stacy was just speaking and Carla was just speaking, a couple of the words that are really present in my practice are curiosity and wonder. and have reframed for people the idea, what I sense Paul was talking about when Paul's talking about praying without ceasing. Even as a little kid, that didn't really make sense in the way that I was being, you need to be praying in this particular way all the time. And so I've reframed it in language of prayerful curiosity and looking for God active in the world in ways that may be outside of church life, but also needs to include a spiritual community of people, a communion of saints. And I think I'm just talking with you more than I'm answering a question, because that's territory I'm in all the time.
Has it forced people to make a decision?
I think some people are seeing it that way.
They're having to act in a different way, and therefore they can't go along to get along, and they're forced to make a decision at that point. They're forced to do something differently that requires them to think about God and themselves and their relationship to their church.
And I think that the word that Paul, excuse me, go ahead.
No, they can't be passive about that. They have to.
Yes.
And so there's a decision point that comes here that I think is causing some of this. And I just may be way off on that, but that's just my.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think Paul keeps coming back to the word intentional. Lots of people are working to find a new way to be intentional about their spiritual lives and the integration of it. And I think COVID's offered a whole host of new ways to either escape that or to dive more deeply into it and be really curious about that. So at some level, I think I can see the possibility of parish life being much more deeply connected and grounded and maybe even intense in the best of ways, and yet much smaller and yet cohesive. I'm watching that too, Natalie.
Yeah.
Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I've got one, and it's something a word I've heard like several times from each of you, and it's the word story. And thinking about the story we tell ourselves. I know I'm armchair psychologist. I know very little about psychology, but I have read that part of the different reactions to people to traumatic circumstances, whether they end up in PTSD and recurring nightmares or not, is the story they tell themselves about what happened. And so and this gets to Stacy, maybe you can answer this since you're dealing with children. Do you help kids with helping them understand the story about what's happening? I hate to use the word agency, and their place as resilient actors in it.
That's an interesting question, and I'm so sorry, but I'm going to have to go in 60 seconds because I've got a client here. But every child sees their world from their own perception, and I have to work with the child within the family system based on the perception and the spiritual beliefs of that family. And so it's a little tricky, if I'm completely honest, because every family sees the pandemic a little differently, and every child kind of has to adjust to what's happened based on their own perception of it. I have some children that just don't care. I mean, they're totally fine with the masks, like no biggie. And then I have other child clients that you can tell that it is absolutely traumatizing to them to have to wear one. And so it's really, based on the perception of that child. And I honestly don't think that we are going to know the ramifications of this on the brains and nervous systems of children for many years. It kind of reminds me of cigarette smoking, like in the 70s and 80s, like everybody's smoking or not. And then like 20 years later, it's got black lung disease and like, oops. it reminds me of that a little bit, and the technology piece with children of letting kiddos be in front of screens, 7 hours a day for school and another 7 hours of video games and all the things. Like, there's just no research really about the long-term effects of that. Dr. Sears, though, who wrote the foreword to my book 30-Day Blackout, he has said that the overuse of screen time in children is the biggest experiment on the brains of young children in the history of mankind. And so I really can't emphasize enough the importance of unplugging as much as you can. I mean, obviously we all have to use screens for work and for school. But trauma is based on your perception. Some children have been traumatized by this and some children have not. So it's really an individual case by case kind of thing. So I hope that was helpful, Paul.
Thank you.
Paul, forgive me. For some reason, I thought this was until 7:30.
It is. We're just.
Okay. I've got a
We've been
client
cooking
here.
with gas
Thank
here,
you.
so.
Thank you for everything. Take
Thank you,
care.
Stacy.
See you
Thank
guys
you,
next
Stacy.
time. Bye-bye.
Yes. Talk about burning the midnight oil. Stacy keeps on going.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Being clients.
I would
Yes.
just add really fast, Paul, Willie, that I think even introducing the idea that the story that I make up is that is always in play in all of our experiences. And so to just introduce the idea that you are telling yourself a story to make meaning of what is happening. So be aware of that, and I do that with adults. I think that could happen with children, so that there's curiosity about, is there a different story I could tell that allows me to feel like I have more locus of control, that allows me to feel like I can see all parts of a story rather than just one part of a story. A lot of times we can look at things like as a Polaroid picture, and I try to invite them to think about it as a moving picture that has some parts of it that are out of the screen that I need to be curious about to help tell the fuller part of, wide angle lens version of the story rather than the really small version of it. And so that, I think, is just helpful concept to introduce, because it gets us all curious about, okay, wait a minute, every interaction I have, the story I make up is, this is what you're doing and this is why you're doing it, or this is what's happening to me and this is the value I place on it. All of that is I'm bringing all parts of my story into how I apply meaning around that. And so I think that can help slow that down a little bit.
Thank you.
Thank you, each one of you and all, for attending tonight.
Yes.
I hope you found it informative and helpful. It was really nice to have Jim and Stacy and Dane and Carla, just hearing all the different perspectives and sharing their own experience.